When you hear the name Pythagoras, what do you think about? Probably some PTSD from math class is involved, or if not, then maybe you think of him as a wise mathematician who paved the way for math and geometry 2000 years ago or something. But if you're like me, you think of him as a scammer and a fraud. Here's why. Contrary to what we think of him today, that being a cosmologist and a mathematician, back in the day he was famous for other reasons, namely being a spiritual leader and to his direct followers, a god. There was even a saying back in the day that there are three types of rational beings. There are humans, there are gods, and then there's Pythagoras, like somewhere in between. Now, why was he seen as a divine figure? Well, apparently someone saw Pythagoras in two places at the same time, at Metempsychosis and at Croton. Then he was also able to speak to rivers. And, well, let's add something more badass, because why not? He also is known for killing a snake by biting it. Maybe he bit its head off or something, I don't know. And probably most significantly, a shaman from Mongolia, or as it was then known, Hyperborea, came to him and presented him with his arrow, which apparently was a token of power. Now, why did he do that? Because Pythagoras, for some reason, maybe for those reasons before mentioned, was recognized as the reincarnation of Apollo, and he is said to have performed incredible miracles like bringing people back to life. So like a Greek version of Jesus. And so, well, Pythagoras was quite a controversial figure. Some of his contemporaries and their later philosophers have some different things to say about him. Some, like Heraclitus, call him the chief of charlatans, while others, like Empedocles, who apparently also had the ability to do miracles and rise people back to life, refers to him as a man who knew remarkable things and who possessed the greatest wealth of intelligence. But even outside of his miracle works, there are other reasons why people thought that he maybe indeed was a god. And the reason for that was that he was the first in Western philosophy to offer a view of the afterlife called Metempsychosis, which Plato, for example, later adopted as well. So what is metempsychosis? So according to Pythagoras, our soul after death reincarnates into another living being. Not necessarily human, but just another being. There is a story coming from another pre-Socratic philosopher by the name of Xenophanes regarding this view of Pythagoras. We have a quote from him saying that once when he, meaning Pythagoras, was present at the beating of a puppy, he pitied it and said, "Stop, don't keep hitting him, since it is the soul of a man who is dear to me, which I recognized when I heard it yelping." Now, how this reincarnation happens, according to Pythagoras' beliefs, we cannot be sure about, but what it surely means is that some part of the soul survives. It may not be intelligence, since that is not shared with animals, but it would imply that we share some emotional capacities and characteristics which are then translated across lives. Now, apparently also because of this, view of the afterlife, Pythagoras claims that he has the power to remember all of his past lives, adding to his status of a religious figure pretty much. This knowledge also granted him a lot of wisdom, but it also opened some room for jokes. Like one later writer mockingly claimed that in one past life, Pythagoras was a beautiful prostitute, and there's so much wisdom he probably gained from that life, right? Now, this view of reincarnation was also heavily tied to his ethical beliefs. One key point is that he probably never ate meat and also refused to even associate with butchers, because if his beliefs were genuine, then eating meat would essentially mean murdering people in a sense, right? Now, coming back to more cultish beliefs or whatever, the Pythagorean way of life offered some interesting aspects. I should mention though that cult is probably not the best word, since most of this way of life was not tied to a new religion, but rather emphasized the existing religion of Greece. But it still was pretty much a group centered around one person and the teachings of one person, so I would still call it a cult, but either way. So Pythagoras, being the sage of the soul, was naturally also an expert in religious matters. One thing we do have is short oral sayings from the Pythagoreans called the Acusmata, which originate from Pythagoras and include instructions on religious practices. For example, one of these Acusmata state that a person shouldn't be buried in wool. However, contradictions arise with some other Acusma. For example, Aristotle and other sources claim that Pythagoreans, according to these laws, were allowed to eat meat, except for certain body parts, and that animal sacrifice was still practiced, which it's quite natural since it was the standard at the time, but quite disappointing. Then other Acusmata include instructions like one should not travel on public roads, which I'm not sure about. It sounds more like a metaphor to me, but I don't know. If you have an idea what this means, leave a comment. I'd love to hear it. Yet probably the most fascinating aspect of the Pythagorean lifestyle was the obsession with silence. Later philosophical historians report that the silence of a Pythagorean was even more admired than someone else's ability to speak. Apparently, to become a student of Pythagoras, you had to remain silent for 5 whole years. And why would anyone do that? Well, that's where the rabbit hole goes deeper. You had to pass this test to possibly be able to acquire some secret knowledge in the school. Knowledge that was not meant for everyone. So again, it sounds kind of cultish in my opinion. But the secrecy was not just limited to knowledge. The Pythagoreans had strong political influence in some parts of Italy, until they were eventually chased out of cities because of their secrecy and large influence. They were not a political party in the traditional sense, but rather a closed political group, akin to the Freemasons or Illuminati. And to join, you likely had to make great sacrifices, like giving up all of your real estate and wealth to the group. Even within the school of Pythagoras, strange stories do circulate. For example, another possibly false but maybe real thing is that a large number of students may never even have saw Pythagoras in person. He or someone else in his place might have taught students behind a curtain. Just imagine if you're a student, there's a curtain in front of you, and apparently Pythagoras sits behind it. And this raises questions about how long Pythagoras actually lived and how long these manipulations went on, well, of course, if they happened at all. But who was the real Pythagoras? As for traditionally Pythagorean things we know them for, like harmony, numbers, mathematics, those were all probably developed by his later followers. In modern times, Pythagoras is most famous for as a mathematician, mainly due to the theorem named after him. However, early evidence suggests that his fame was not originally based on mathematics and cosmology, but instead all of those things we mentioned before. Yet why are all of these things attributed to him? Well, it was likely because of his status as a godlike figure, and because his followers wrote books in his name. Later, the Pythagoreans of the time tried to also claim that Plato had copied Pythagoras. And in fact, not just Plato, but everything in philosophy, well, which was correct or thought at the time as correct, and even the word itself was the creation of Pythagoras, which of course is false. There is one theory, however, that based on Aristotle's references to the so-called Pythagoreans, that there were actually two groups of Pythagoras followers. I actually have no idea how to pronounce this, but there were the Acusmatici or Acusmatici, I have no idea, who followed on ritualistic teachings, meaning the Acusmata, and were considered by Aristotle to be false Pythagoreans. While there were also the Metempsychosis or Mathematici, who were true Pythagoreans, focusing on mathematical and cosmological studies. So even though Pythagoras probably didn't invent anything we attribute to him, he probably still had interest in mathematics. He maybe even traveled to other places to actually gain mathematical knowledge, and he generally was just interested in it and just spread the interest with other people. One last thing, Pythagoras is said to have introduced the idea that after a certain amount of intervals, the things that have happened once happen again, so that nothing is completely new. This is a concept called eternal recurrence, where everything in the universe repeats indefinitely. Some people think it was Nietzsche who thought about this, but no, Pythagoras was apparently the first one, so I mean, that's cool. So in conclusion, although Pythagoras did provide some interesting ideas for sure, his title as a mathematician and as a cosmologist is probably fake, and he probably was a fraud. Don't point a gun at me for saying that he probably wasn't a god and he was just somewhat of a modern spiritual guru. fooling his followers for his gain or glory. But that's just my opinion, and thanks for watching.